On the 23rd of March, 1945, a transport train rattled through the pine forests of rural Alabama, carrying 37 prisoners across a landscape that might as well have been another planet. Inside one of the sealed carriages, Margareta Hoffman sat with her wrists bound in iron cuffs, watching American soil pass by through a narrow window, and believed with absolute certainty that she understood exactly what awaited her. She had been told again and again what happened to prisoners in enemy hands. She had seen the pamphlets, heard the speeches, absorbed the warnings until they became part of her very understanding of the world. And now, watching the foreign trees slide past in the fading afternoon light, she prepared herself for the barbarism she had been promised would come. She could not have been more wrong about what the next 18 months would teach her. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Margaret would discover in a small prisoner facility outside Montgomery would shatter every assumption she had carried across the Atlantic. Taught by a soft-spoken man whose very existence contradicted everything she thought she knew about race, power, and human dignity. By the time she returned to Germany in 1946, she would be forever changed, carrying with her a story so unexpected that even 70 years later, it would challenge our understanding of that complex and terrible era. Margaret Hoffman had never imagined she would see America. Born in Hamburg in 1922, she had grown up in a household that valued discipline, order, and service to the nation. Her father worked as a municipal administrator. Her mother managed their modest apartment with Germanic precision, and Margaret herself had excelled in her studies, particularly in languages and mathematics. When the opportunity came in 1941 to join the auxiliary services, supporting the military communications infrastructure, she had accepted without hesitation. It was her duty. It was what any proper German woman would do in such times. For 3 years, she worked in a signals office outside Bremen, processing coded communications, managing personnel files, and occasionally translating intercepted messages. The work was tedious but important, and she took pride in her efficiency. She rarely questioned the larger purposes her work served. The regime's ideology had seeped into daily life so thoroughly that it became like air, invisible, pervasive, unexamined. She believed what she had been taught because everyone around her believed it too, and because questioning it simply did not occur to her as a possibility. In February 1945, as the conflict's end became increasingly inevitable, her facility was overrun by advancing Allied forces. Margaret was among 243 female auxiliary personnel who were captured in a single operation. The transition from captor to captive happened so quickly she barely had time to process it. One moment she was destroying sensitive documents according to emergency protocols. The next, foreign soldiers were shouting instructions in English she struggled to understand fully, despite her language training, because terror made comprehension difficult. They were processed, documented, and eventually transported to a British holding facility, then transferred to American custody for eventual shipment across the Atlantic. The entire journey existed in a haze of fear and confusion. The other women whispered constantly about what would happen to them. Some spoke of labor camps where prisoners were worked until they died. Others mentioned more terrible fates, particularly for women, though these were spoken of only in the most hushed tones. Margaret tried to maintain composure, but the uncertainty gnawed at her constantly. The Atlantic crossing took 11 days aboard a converted cargo vessel. Margaret spent most of it below deck, where hundreds of prisoners huddled in cramped quarters that smelled of unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, and fear. She made few friends during the voyage. Most prisoners clustered into small groups based on where they had been captured or which units they had served with. Margaret, separated from her closest colleagues during the chaotic processing in England, found herself largely alone. She spent the crossing writing in a small notebook she had somehow managed to keep through the entire ordeal, documenting her thoughts and observations in careful, precise script. When they finally reached American shores in early March, Margaret experienced her first real shock. The port facilities in Virginia were massive, larger than anything she had seen in Europe. Enormous cranes moved with mechanical precision, loading and unloading vessels of staggering size. Trucks and trains moved in organized streams that spoke to industrial capacity she had not truly comprehended before. She had heard about American production, of course. Everyone had heard the numbers, but seeing it was different. The sheer abundance of everything, equipment, vehicles, supplies stacked in mountains, made something shift uncomfortably in her understanding. They remained at the Virginia Processing Center for 5 days. During that time, Margaret was photographed, fingerprinted, interviewed multiple times through translators, and eventually assigned to a prisoner group being sent to facilities in the southern states. The American soldiers who processed them were efficient, but not cruel. This itself was surprising. She had expected brutality, or at least obvious hatred. Instead, she encountered bureaucratic indifference punctuated by occasional, inexplicable kindness, a guard who brought extra water during the medical examination, another who spoke slowly so the translator could keep up during her interview. On March 23rd, she was placed on the train with 36 other female prisoners and a small contingent of male prisoners being transported to various facilities throughout Alabama. The journey took 2 days. During that time, Margaret watched America pass by through the narrow window. The landscape was beautiful in a way that troubled her. Endless forests, wide rivers, towns that looked peaceful and prosperous, despite the nation being engaged in global conflict. She saw no bomb damage, no shortages, no signs of the hardship that had become daily reality in Germany. Instead, she saw farms with equipment that looked new, towns with lights that burned brightly into the night, and people who did not look hungry or afraid. When the train finally stopped at a small station outside Montgomery, Margaret had been awake for nearly 30 hours. Exhaustion made everything feel slightly unreal as they were unloaded and transferred to military trucks. The Alabama heat, even in late March, was oppressive compared to the German spring she had left behind. The air was thick and humid, carrying scents she did not recognize, pine sap, red clay dust, something sweet she could not identify. The facility they were taken to was smaller than she had expected. It had been constructed on the grounds of what looked like a former agricultural station, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by fencing and guard towers. The main compound could perhaps hold 300 prisoners at most. As they arrived, Margaret could see male prisoners working in a distant field supervised by guards. The scene was almost pastoral, which made it more disorienting. Where was the brutality she had been promised? The new arrivals were assembled in a courtyard area as the sun began to set. An officer gave instructions in English that a German-speaking corporal translated. They would be processed, assigned barracks, given work details. There would be rules. Violations would result in punishment. Cooperation would be rewarded with additional privileges. The speech was formal and bureaucratic, delivered without particular emotion or threat. As the translator finished, Margaret noticed a figure standing slightly apart from the main group of guards and administrative personnel. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing the uniform of an American sergeant. His skin was dark, darker than any person she had seen before except in photographs and propaganda materials. He stood with quiet authority, observing the new arrivals with an expression that was attentive without being aggressive. Something about his bearing made several of the German prisoners shift uncomfortably. The sergeant's name was Thomas Washington, though Margaret would not learn this until the following day. He was 32 years old, born in Montgomery, and had served in the United States Army since 1942. Before the conflict, he had worked as a teacher at a colored school, educating children whose opportunities were severely limited by the racial laws that still governed the South. He had joined the military expecting to fight, but the Army had other plans. His education and steady temperament made him valuable in administrative and supervisory roles. After training, he had been assigned to prisoner facilities, first in North Carolina, then transferred to this Alabama location in late 1944. Thomas had no illusions about the contradictions of his position. He wore the uniform of a nation that declared all men equal, while maintaining systems of profound inequality. He supervised prisoners from a regime that had codified racial hatred into law while living under laws that mandated his separation from white citizens in nearly every aspect of daily life. The irony was not lost on him. But Thomas Washington was a practical man who dealt with the world as it was, not as it should be. His job was to supervise prisoner work details, ensure security protocols were followed, and manage the daily operation of the facility's agricultural programs. He did this work with competence and quiet dignity. On that first evening, as the new prisoners were processed and assigned barracks, Thomas watched them carefully. He had supervised hundreds of prisoners by this point and had developed an ability to read them quickly. Some arrived defiant, others broken, most simply confused and frightened. The women were generally more difficult in some ways, more emotional, more prone to despair, but also more likely to adapt once they understood their situation was not what they had feared. His eyes lingered briefly on Margaret as she moved through the processing line. She was of medium height, thin from poor rations during the final months in Europe, with blonde hair pulled back severely and eyes that darted around constantly, cataloguing everything. She moved with stiff precision, as if maintaining rigid control was the only thing preventing complete collapse. Thomas recognized that type, the ones who survived through discipline and order, whose entire identity was built on structure. Those ones either adapted well once they understood the new structure, or they broke completely when forced to confront ideas that contradicted their rigid worldview. The women prisoners were housed in a separate barracks section, segregated from the male prisoners by 200 yards and additional fencing. The building Margaret was assigned to had been constructed specifically for this purpose, a long wooden structure with 20 bunk beds, basic sanitation facilities, and small windows set high in the walls. It was sparse but clean and significantly better than the transport ship accommodations. Each prisoner received a thin mattress, 2 rough blankets, a pillow, and a small footlocker for personal items. Margaret claimed an upper bunk near the back corner, instinctively seeking a position that offered some sense of security. Around her, the other women were settling in with various degrees of distress. Some wept quietly, others maintained stoic silence. A few attempted to organize their immediate space with obsessive precision, imposing order on the only thing they could control. That first night, sleep came only in fragments. The Alabama night was full of unfamiliar sounds, insects she did not recognize, distant train whistles, the calls of nightbirds. Through it all, Margaret's mind raced with questions and fears about what would come next. She had survived the crossing. Now she had to survive whatever this strange place would demand of her. Morning came early. At 5:30, bells rang throughout the compound, and prisoners were expected to rise, dress, and assemble for count within 20 minutes. Margaret moved through the routine on automatic, drawing on years of practiced discipline. The count was followed by a basic breakfast in the mess hall, oatmeal bread, something that was allegedly coffee but tasted like nothing she had ever experienced before. The portions were small but adequate, more than she had eaten regularly in the final months in Germany. After breakfast, work assignments were posted. Margaret found her name listed under agricultural detail, supervised by Sergeant Washington. She and 14 other women were directed to assemble at the eastern gate of the compound at 700 hours. When Margaret arrived at the designated location, Sergeant Washington was already there, clipboard in hand, standing beside a truck loaded with tools and equipment. This was her first close encounter with him. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 6 feet tall with a powerful build that suggested physical labor in his background. His uniform was immaculately maintained. His expression was serious but not unkind. When he spoke, his voice was deep and carried easily without being raised. Thomas addressed the assembled women in English, his words translated by a German prisoner who had been assigned as group interpreter, a woman named Elsa who had taught English before the conflict. His instructions were straightforward. They would be working in the facility's vegetable gardens, which provided supplementary food for both prisoners and the guard staff. The work would be supervised, but not excessively difficult. Performance would be noted. Good work would be acknowledged. Poor work or refusal to work would result in reduced privileges. As he spoke, Thomas observed the women's reactions. Most looked down or away, uncomfortable with direct contact. A few met his gaze briefly before looking aside. Cultural conditioning about race mixed with their prisoner status created a complicated dynamic. Thomas had dealt with this countless times. German prisoners, especially those deeply indoctrinated, often struggled with being supervised by a black American. The cognitive dissonance was visible in their expressions: confusion, discomfort, sometimes barely concealed contempt that they did not dare express openly given their current powerlessness. Margaret listened to the translated instructions while watching the sergeant peripherally. She had never been this close to a black person before. Everything in her upbringing and education had taught her that such people were inferior, incapable of the kind of authority and competence this man clearly possessed. Yet here he stood, in a position of complete power over her, speaking with calm authority, organizing complex logistics with evident capability. The contradiction created a dissonance she pushed away. She was too tired, too overwhelmed to process it now. The work detail was transported by truck to a large field about half a mile from the main compound. The vegetable garden was extensive, perhaps 5 acres divided into neat rows of various crops. Some areas were already producing early spring vegetables that thrived in Alabama's climate. Other sections were being prepared for planting later crops. The women were divided into 3 groups and assigned different tasks. Margaretta's group would be weeding and thinning the lettuce rows. The work itself was not particularly difficult, just tedious and physically demanding for women who had spent weeks in confinement with minimal physical activity. Margaret knelt in the red Alabama clay, pulling weeds according to the instructions they had been given, and tried not to think about how far she had fallen. She had been educated, competent, part of something larger than herself. Now she was on her knees in foreign dirt, a prisoner with no idea when or if she would ever return home. Sergeant Washington moved through the field, observing the work, occasionally correcting technique, ensuring no one was struggling excessively. His supervision was attentive without being oppressive. He did not shout or threaten. When he needed to correct someone, he did so clearly and without unnecessary harshness. Margaret noticed this despite herself. The guards she had seen in the British facility had been much more aggressive, constantly shouting, treating prisoners with barely concealed contempt. This man's quiet competence was something different. Around mid-morning, one of the older women in Margaret's group collapsed from the heat. She had been struggling for the past hour, her movements becoming increasingly unsteady, but had not said anything. When she finally went down, several women rushed to help her. Sergeant Washington was there within seconds. He moved with surprising speed for such a large man, immediately assessing the situation. He called to one of the guards to bring water, then carefully moved the woman into shade. His hands were gentle as he checked her pulse and loosened her collar. He spoke to her calmly in English, even though she clearly did not understand, his tone reassuring. Margaret watched from a few yards away, confused by what she was seeing. The care in his actions did not match what she had expected. He treated the woman not as a prisoner to be managed, but as a person in distress who needed help. When the water arrived, he supported her carefully while she drank, ensuring she did not take too much too quickly. He then arranged for her to be transported back to the facility's medical station for evaluation. The entire interaction took perhaps 10 minutes, but it made an impression on several of the watching prisoners. The incident created a shift in the work detail's atmosphere. Some of the tension that had characterized the morning dissipated. The prisoners still worked quietly, still maintained their distance from the guards, but something had changed. Margaret found herself glancing toward Sergeant Washington more frequently, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she thought she knew. They broke for lunch at noon, sandwiches and water brought out to the field. The prisoners sat in the shade of several large oak trees, eating quietly. Sergeant Washington and the 2 other guards maintained a respectful distance, giving the women space while remaining vigilant. During this break, Margaret noticed Thomas reading a book. This detail caught her attention because it was unexpected. The book appeared worn, well used. She could not see the title from her position, but the fact that he was reading at all challenged another assumption. She had been taught that such people were intellectually inferior, incapable of engaging with complex ideas. Yet here was this man, in his limited free moments, choosing to read. The afternoon work continued until 4, at which point they were transported back to the compound. The women were exhausted, muscles aching from unaccustomed labor, skin reddened despite attempts to stay in shade. They were given time to wash and rest before the evening meal. Margaret sat on her bunk afterward, too tired to do anything but stare at the wall. Her hands were blistered despite the work gloves they had been provided. Her back ached, but she had survived the first full day. This pattern repeated for the next 6 days. Each morning, assembly at the gate, transport to the fields, work under Sergeant Washington's supervision, return to the compound in late afternoon. The routine was exhausting but bearable, and each day Margaret observed the sergeant more closely, her curiosity growing despite herself. She noticed how he treated the prisoners with consistent respect, never using degrading language, never using his position to humiliate or intimidate. She noticed how he knew each prisoner's name by the 3rd day, how he adjusted work assignments based on individual capabilities without making a show of it. She noticed how he intervened when one of the other guards made a crude comment toward a prisoner, speaking quietly but firmly until the guard backed down. She noticed how he sometimes hummed while working, soft melodies she did not recognize, but found oddly comforting in their rhythm. By the end of the first week, Margaretta's initial terror had faded, replaced by a different kind of unease. The facility was not the horror she had feared. The work was hard but not impossible. The guards were strict but not cruel, at least most of them, and Sergeant Washington remained a puzzle she could not solve, using the framework she had been given for understanding the world. The second week brought a change in her assignment. Elsa, the woman who had been serving as interpreter for the work details, was transferred to administrative duties inside the main compound. The guards needed a replacement, someone who could communicate adequately in both German and English. After reviewing the prisoner files, they selected Margaret. Her language skills, noted in her intake documents, made her the obvious choice. On Monday morning, instead of joining the regular work detail, Margaret was instructed to report directly to Sergeant Washington. She found him in a small office attached to the agricultural equipment storage building. The office was sparse: a desk, 2 chairs, filing cabinets, a single window overlooking the fields. Thomas looked up as she entered, gestured to one of the chairs. Through halting English and careful enunciation, they established the basic arrangement. Margaret would serve as translator for his work details, facilitating communication between guards and prisoners. She would help coordinate work assignments, ensure instructions were understood, assist with any issues that arose. In exchange, she would receive slightly larger rations and certain minor privileges, an extra hour of free time in the evenings, permission to access the facility's small library. As Thomas explained all this, Margaret listened carefully, both to his words and to the manner of their delivery. He spoke to her as one competent adult to another, not as master to subordinate, despite the vast power imbalance between them. His English was educated, his diction clear, his vocabulary sophisticated. Again, the dissonance. Everything she had been taught said this should not be possible. Over the following weeks, Margaret worked closely with Sergeant Washington on a daily basis. The proximity forced interaction that gradually eroded her initial discomfort. They discussed work assignments, crop rotation schedules, prisoner capabilities and limitations. Thomas proved to be an excellent manager, organized, fair, responsive to problems. He listened when Margaret pointed out that certain prisoners had skills that were being underutilized. He adjusted schedules when she explained that the pace was too demanding for some of the older women. He created a system for the prisoners to request specific work assignments based on their capabilities and preferences. During these daily interactions, Margaret began to see Thomas as an individual rather than a representative of a category she had been taught to dismiss. She learned that he had taught mathematics and history before the conflict. She learned that he read extensively, not just technical manuals, but literature, philosophy, history, from multiple perspectives. She learned that he had grown up in Montgomery, in a community that maintained dignity and aspiration despite systematic oppression. She learned that he was soft-spoken by nature but could project authority when necessary. She learned that he had a subtle sense of humor that emerged in small moments, a wry comment about military bureaucracy, a gentle observation about human nature. One afternoon in late April, as they reviewed the week's work schedules in his office, Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked. They had been discussing a particularly difficult prisoner, a woman who refused to work, who spent her days in bitter, angry silence. Thomas had asked Margaret to try speaking with her, to understand what was driving the refusal. The conversation had brought up memories Margaret had been suppressing. Her voice broke as she tried to explain the woman's perspective. Suddenly she was talking not just about the difficult prisoner, but about herself, about the profound disorientation of losing everything she thought she understood about the world. The words came in a rush, in German, too fast for careful translation. She spoke about her father, who had believed so completely in the system that had now collapsed. She spoke about her work in the signals office, how proud she had been of her efficiency, how she had never questioned what her efficiency was supporting. She spoke about the shame that was beginning to emerge as she recognized her complicity in something terrible, even if she had never fully understood what she was complicit in. Thomas listened without interruption. When she finally exhausted herself into silence, embarrassed by the outburst, he sat quietly for a moment before speaking. His response was in English, but he spoke slowly enough that she could follow. He told her about teaching children who were brilliant but would never have opportunities equal to their capabilities. He told her about watching his own students internalize messages of inferiority, seeing their confidence erode under the constant pressure of a society that told them they were less. He told her about the choice he had made to fight that internalization every day, to model dignity and competence and intellectual engagement, even when the broader world tried to deny these things were possible, for someone with his skin color. Then he said something that pierced through Margaret's defenses. He told her that recognizing you have been wrong about fundamental things was perhaps the hardest thing a person could do, that it required more courage than maintaining comfortable certainty, that the shame she was feeling was actually evidence of moral growth, painful as that growth might be. The conversation lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When it ended, Margaret felt emotionally exhausted but also somehow lighter. They returned to discussing work schedules, but something between them had shifted. A degree of trust had been established. Over the following months, this trust deepened. Margaret found herself looking forward to the daily planning sessions with Thomas. Their discussions ranged beyond work logistics to broader topics: history, philosophy, the challenge of building moral systems that could encompass all of humanity's diversity. Thomas was careful never to lecture or condescend, but he made his perspectives clear. He challenged Margaret's assumptions, not through confrontation, but through questions that forced her to examine her own reasoning. In June, the facility received news that the conflict in Europe had definitively ended. For the prisoners, this brought mixed reactions. Relief that the dying had stopped, mixed with uncertainty about what would happen to them now. Would they be sent home? When? To what kind of Germany? The country they had left no longer existed. What would replace it? During this uncertain period, Margaret's role expanded. She began assisting with administrative tasks beyond translation, helping to organize prisoner mail, coordinating the allocation of packages from relief organizations, managing the facility's small educational program that offered basic classes in English and vocational skills. The work kept her occupied and gave her purpose beyond the tedium of field labor. One afternoon in early July, Margaret was working in the administrative office when she overheard a conversation between two guards. They were discussing Sergeant Washington, their voices carrying an edge of resentment. One was complaining about having to take orders from someone they referred to, using language that made Margaret's stomach turn. The other agreed, suggesting that once the prisoners were shipped home, maybe Washington would be reassigned to a position more appropriate to his place in the social order. The casual hatred in their voices shocked Margaret, not because she had never heard such sentiments before, but because she had expressed similar sentiments herself not so long ago. Hearing her own former attitudes reflected back at her from these guards made her recognize how thoroughly her perspective had shifted. She had come to respect Thomas Washington, to value his judgment, to see him as fundamentally her superior in competence and moral clarity. The guards' racist dismissal of him made her angry in a way she would not have thought possible 6 months earlier. That evening, she found herself thinking about the peculiar cruelty of the situation. Thomas Washington, who possessed more education, competence, and moral authority than most of the white guards at the facility, would return after the conflict to a society that denied him basic dignity. He could not eat in most restaurants, could not stay in most hotels, faced constant humiliation and systematic exclusion. Meanwhile, prisoners like herself, who had supported a regime built on theories of racial hierarchy and violent conquest, would eventually return to rebuild their country with the support of the very people they had thought inferior. The irony was bitter and profound. In August, Margaret was sitting in Thomas's office, reviewing supply requisitions, when he mentioned almost casually that he had been reading German philosophy, Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. He asked her perspective on certain passages, acknowledging that his German was limited and he might be missing nuances in translation. The conversation that followed was wide-ranging and intellectually stimulating. Margaret found herself defending positions she had never articulated before, challenged by Thomas's thoughtful questions and alternative interpretations. At one point, discussing Kant's categorical imperative, Thomas observed that the principle of treating people as ends in themselves, rather than means to an end, seemed fundamentally incompatible with systems built on inherent human hierarchies. Whether those hierarchies were based on race, nationality, religion, or any other category, they all reduced certain people to instruments for others' purposes. He said this without accusation, as a philosophical observation. But Margaret understood the deeper question embedded in the statement. She had dedicated years of her life to serving a system built on precisely such hierarchies. She had been a means to that system's ends, yes, but she had also treated others as means to ends she never questioned. The recognition of this filled her with a shame that was becoming familiar, not the sharp shock of initial realization, but the duller, deeper ache of ongoing moral reckoning. In September, the facility received notification that prisoner repatriation would begin within the next 6 months. The exact timeline depended on complex logistical considerations and ongoing political negotiations about Germany's future. For Margaret, the news brought conflicting emotions. She wanted to go home to see what remained of her family and her city, but she also felt profound anxiety about leaving this strange place where she had been forced to confront and dismantle so many of her foundational beliefs. During this period, Thomas began preparing Margaret for her eventual return. In their daily conversations, he encouraged her to think about what she would do with the understanding she had gained. He spoke about the importance of bearing witness, not just to the obvious horrors of the regime she had served, but to the more subtle cruelties of systems that sorted people into hierarchies based on characteristics they did not choose. He spoke about the responsibility of those who recognized injustice to name it clearly, even when doing so was uncomfortable or inconvenient. One October afternoon, as they walked through the harvested fields discussing the next season's planting schedule, Thomas told Margaret something personal. He spoke about his time teaching, about a particular student named Marcus, who had possessed extraordinary mathematical ability. Marcus had dreamed of becoming an engineer, but the opportunities simply did not exist. After graduating, he had found work as a janitor, his talents completely wasted. Thomas had watched this brilliant young man's aspirations slowly erode, replaced by resignation and diminished expectations. Thomas told this story without obvious anger, but Margaret could hear the pain underneath the calm recitation. He explained that he thought about Marcus often, wondering what the world was losing by maintaining systems that crushed human potential based on arbitrary classifications. He said that every person who benefited from such systems, even those who never actively chose them, bore some responsibility for their perpetuation. The implication was clear. Margaret had benefited from systems of hierarchy, had served them without question. Now she had a choice about what to do with that recognition. Thomas did not tell her what that choice should be. He simply made clear that the choice existed and mattered. By November, Margaret's transformation was nearly complete. She no longer resembled the frightened, rigidly certain woman who had arrived 8 months earlier. She had lost weight. Her hands were permanently roughened from agricultural work. Her skin had darkened from outdoor labor. But the more significant changes were internal. Her moral framework had been dismantled and rebuilt on different foundations. Her understanding of human capability and worth had expanded to encompass realities she had previously denied. Her sense of certainty had been replaced by humility and ongoing questioning. The relationship between Margaret and Thomas had evolved into something resembling friendship, though both understood the profound limitations imposed by their circumstances. They could not be equals in the current context. He was a guard, she was a prisoner. He was American, she was German. He was black in a society built on white supremacy. She was white with all the unearned advantages that entailed. But within their daily interactions, they had found a space of mutual respect and genuine connection. In early December, the facility received word that the first group of female prisoners would be repatriated in mid-January. Margareta was on the list. She had less than 6 weeks remaining in Alabama. The knowledge created a strange melancholy. She wanted to go home, but she would miss aspects of this experience, the daily routines, the gradual learning, the conversations that had reshaped her understanding. Most of all, she would miss Thomas Washington, who had treated her with more consistent dignity and respect than many of the people who shared her ethnicity and nationality. On a cold morning in late December, Margaret was working in the administrative office when Thomas called her into his private office. He had something he wanted to give her before she left. From his desk drawer he produced a book, a worn copy of W.E.B., Du Bois' writings, translated into German. He had ordered it months earlier, waiting for the right moment to present it. He told Margaret that if she truly wanted to understand the systems she was beginning to question, she needed to read the perspectives of those who had been systematically excluded and oppressed. He explained that Du Bois wrote about the experience of what he called double consciousness, the psychological burden of seeing oneself both through one's own eyes and through the contemptuous eyes of a dominant society that considered you inferior. Thomas said he thought this concept might help Margaret understand not just the American experience of racial injustice, but the broader human damage caused by all systems built on theories of inherent hierarchy. Margaret accepted the book with trembling hands. The gift represented trust that she would read it seriously, trust that she had genuinely changed, trust that she would use her understanding for something meaningful. She promised him she would read it carefully. She promised she would remember what she had learned here. She promised she would try to live according to the understanding she had gained, difficult as that might prove. Thomas nodded, then said something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. He told her that the true measure of a person was not whether they had been wrong, because everyone was wrong about important things at various points in their lives. The measure was whether they could recognize their wrongness, change their understanding, and then act on that new understanding even when doing so was costly or uncomfortable. He said he believed she had that capacity. Now she would have the opportunity to prove it. They shook hands, a formal gesture that nonetheless carried profound meaning. In that moment, the prisoner and the guard, the German and the American, the woman who had served a regime built on racial hatred, and the man who lived under laws mandating racial separation, acknowledged each other as moral equals, engaged in the shared human struggle toward greater understanding and justice. The final weeks passed quickly. Margaret completed her administrative duties, helped train her replacement, and prepared for the long journey home. She spent her free time reading the book Thomas had given her, struggling with some of the concepts, but gradually absorbing Du Bois's analysis of systemic oppression and its psychological impacts. The parallels between his descriptions of American racial hierarchy and the systems she had lived under in Germany were disturbing and enlightening. On her last morning at the facility, Margaret rose before dawn. She wanted to walk through the fields one final time, to fix this place in her memory. The January morning was cold by Alabama standards, though mild compared to German winters. She walked along the rows where she had labored, touched the soil that had absorbed her sweat, looked toward the small office where she had spent so many hours in conversation that changed her life. Thomas found her there as the sun was rising. They stood together in silence for several minutes, both knowing this was goodbye. There would be no letters. The gulf between their worlds was too vast for correspondence to be practical or appropriate. This moment was all they would have. Finally, Thomas spoke. He told her to be brave in using what she had learned. He told her the world needed people who could change their minds, who could admit error and grow from it. He told her she had the strength to bear witness truthfully, even when truth was uncomfortable. He told her he was proud of the growth she had demonstrated. Margaret tried to express what the past months had meant, how completely he had upended her understanding of the world, how she would carry his example with her always. The words felt inadequate. How could she summarize such profound transformation? How could she explain that this black American sergeant had taught her more about human dignity and moral courage than anyone else in her entire life? Thomas simply nodded, understanding what she could not quite articulate. He told her one final thing before she had to report for transport. He said that recognizing shared humanity across all the artificial boundaries people constructed was not easy. It required constant effort, constant willingness to question one's assumptions, constant humility. But it was the only path toward a world that could break cycles of hatred and violence. He said he believed she understood that now. He hoped she would help others understand it too. They shook hands again. Then Margaret turned and walked back toward the compound to collect her few possessions and join the other prisoners preparing for departure. She did not look back, but she carried Thomas Washington's lessons with her as surely as she carried the book in her small bag. The repatriation journey was long and tedious, trains to the coast, processing through various facilities, eventually boarding a ship for the Atlantic crossing. Margaret spent much of the journey reading and rereading the book Thomas had given her, filling the margins with notes and questions. The other prisoners left her mostly alone, mistaking her introspection for depression, or perhaps recognizing that she had been changed in ways they could not quite comprehend. Hamburg, when she finally reached it in February 1946, was almost unrecognizable. Vast sections of the city had been destroyed by bombing. Buildings she remembered from childhood existed only as rubble. The population was struggling with severe shortages of food, fuel, and basic necessities. The psychological damage was even more profound than the physical destruction. People moved through the ruins in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of their loss and the horror of what had been done in their name. Margaret discovered that her father had not survived the conflict's final months. Her mother was alive, living in a partially destroyed apartment building, surviving on rations provided by occupying forces and whatever could be obtained through desperate improvisation. Their reunion was emotional but strained. Her mother seemed to have aged 20 years in the less than 2 years since Margaret had last seen her. In the weeks that followed, as Margaret tried to rebuild some semblance of life in the destroyed city, she struggled with how to communicate what she had experienced and learned. Her mother and the other survivors around her were focused on immediate survival, finding food, shelter, fuel for heating. Philosophical discussions about moral responsibility and systemic injustice seemed absurdly abstract in the face of such concrete suffering. But Margaret gradually found ways to integrate her new understanding into daily life. She refused to participate in conversations that blamed Germany's defeat on external enemies, while avoiding responsibility for the regime's crimes. When others spoke nostalgically about aspects of the previous system, she quietly but firmly challenged those reminiscences. When opportunities arose to help displaced persons or refugees, she did so without questioning whether they belonged to the right categories of humanity. Perhaps most significantly, when educational programs began to emerge in Hamburg, Margaret volunteered to teach English to young people. In her classroom, she tried to pass on some of what Thomas Washington had taught her, not explicitly, for such direct instruction would have been dismissed or misunderstood, but through the way she treated her students, the questions she encouraged them to ask, the perspectives she exposed them to. She never saw Thomas Washington again. She had no way of knowing what happened to him after the conflict, whether he returned to teaching, whether he found ways to continue his quiet work of modeling dignity and competence in the face of systemic oppression. But she thought about him often, especially in moments when maintaining her new convictions felt difficult or costly. Years later, when Margaret was in her 40s and Germany had been rebuilt into a prosperous democratic nation, she began writing about her experiences. Not for publication, she never sought that kind of attention, but for her own understanding and for her children, so they might know how their mother had learned to question received wisdom and think for herself. In these private writings, she described Thomas Washington in detail, trying to capture the quiet authority and moral clarity that had so completely overturned her previous worldview. She wrote about the profound irony of being taught human dignity by a man whose own society denied him dignity. She wrote about the shame of recognizing her complicity in systems of dehumanization. She wrote about the ongoing challenge of living according to principles that required constant self-examination and humility. Most of all, she wrote about gratitude for the unlikely circumstance that had placed her in a small facility in Alabama, under the supervision of a man wise enough and patient enough to help her see beyond the lies she had been taught. Thomas Washington's impact extended far beyond one German prisoner. Throughout his time supervising prisoner facilities, he treated hundreds of prisoners with the same respect and dignity he showed Margaret. Many of these prisoners returned to Germany carrying similar lessons, their worldviews similarly challenged. Some rejected what they had experienced, clinging to their previous certainties, but others, like Margaret, allowed their understanding to be transformed. In small ways, across countless individual interactions, people like Thomas Washington planted seeds of doubt in ideological certainty, seeds that sometimes grew into genuine moral development. After the conflict, Thomas did return to teaching in Montgomery. He spent the next 2 decades educating black students, continuing his quiet resistance against systems designed to limit their possibilities. He participated in the civil rights movement that would eventually dismantle legal segregation, bringing to that struggle the same patient persistence and moral clarity he had demonstrated in the prisoner facilities. He taught his students not just mathematics and history, but also dignity, critical thinking, and the importance of judging people by their character and capabilities, rather than arbitrary categories. Thomas never spoke much about his time supervising prisoners. When asked about it, he would simply say that he had done his duty, tried to treat people decently, and hoped that some of them had learned something worth knowing. He did not see himself as exceptional. He was simply a man trying to live according to principles he believed were right, even in circumstances that often seemed designed to make such living difficult. He died in 1983 at the age of 70, surrounded by family and former students who gathered to celebrate a life lived with remarkable consistency and integrity. At his funeral, several speakers mentioned the impact he had made through his teaching, his example, and his unwavering commitment to human dignity across all boundaries. None of them knew about Margaret Hoffman or the hundreds of other prisoners whose lives he had touched. Those stories remained untold, private transformations that rippled outward in ways impossible to fully trace. Margaret lived until 2004, reaching the age of 82. In her final years, she told her grandchildren about the Black American sergeant who had changed her life by refusing to treat her as her own regime had taught her to treat others. Her grandchildren struggled to fully comprehend the story. They had grown up in a Germany that officially rejected racial hierarchy, that taught the horrors of the previous regime, that presented itself as having learned from history. The idea that their grandmother had once believed such different things seemed almost incomprehensible, but Margaret insisted they understand. She told them that the capacity for moral blindness existed in every generation. That ideology could make people accept and support terrible things while believing themselves to be good. She told them the only defense against such blindness was constant questioning, willingness to challenge one's own assumptions, and attention to the humanity of those whom systems encouraged you to dismiss or dehumanize. She told them that sometimes the people who taught the most important lessons came from unexpected places, and that one had to be humble enough to learn from anyone with wisdom to offer. The story of Thomas Washington and Margaret Hoffman illustrates something important about that complex era. The great moral dramas of the Second World War are often told through the lens of large movements, military operations and political decisions, but countless smaller dramas unfolded in quieter spaces, where individual humans encountered each other across vast chasms of difference and sometimes managed to bridge those chasms through simple decency and patient interaction. These smaller stories do not redeem the larger horrors. Nothing can balance the immense suffering caused by regimes built on theories of human hierarchy and violent conquest. But they do remind us that even in the worst circumstances, individual humans retain the capacity for growth, change, and moral development. They remind us that teaching and learning can happen in unlikely places, between unlikely people. They remind us that the boundaries we construct between us and them, between superior and inferior, between worthy and unworthy, are artificial constructs that can be challenged and overcome. The prisoner facility outside Montgomery, where this story unfolded, no longer exists. The buildings were dismantled decades ago, the land returned to agricultural use or developed for other purposes. No historical marker indicates what happened there. The transformation that occurred in Margaretha Hoffman and others like her left no physical trace. Only scattered documentary evidence remains, prisoner records, work reports, administrative files stored in military archives that few people ever consult. But the impact of what happened there persisted in ways both subtle and profound. Margaret returned to Germany and lived according to different principles than those she had arrived with. She raised children who absorbed those principles, who passed them to their own children. She influenced students she taught, colleagues she worked with, communities she participated in. The lessons Thomas Washington taught rippled outward through decades of her life, touching hundreds of people who never knew they were benefiting from the wisdom of a Black American sergeant who had supervised prisoner work details in rural Alabama during the final year of a global conflict. Thomas Washington's impact similarly extended through time and across countless interactions. The students he taught carried forward his example of dignity and moral clarity. Some became teachers themselves, passing on not just academic knowledge but also the deeper lessons about human worth and the importance of questioning unjust systems. The prisoners he supervised carried his lessons back to their home countries, where some of them worked to build different kinds of societies, based on different principles than those that had led to such catastrophic destruction. These impacts are impossible to quantify or trace with precision. History does not work through simple cause and effect when it comes to moral development and the slow, difficult work of building more just societies. But they were real nonetheless. Every person who learned to question dehumanizing ideologies, every individual who extended dignity to those whom systems encouraged them to dismiss, every act of moral courage that challenged accepted injustice, these accumulated over time, gradually shifting cultures and possibilities. The story of the black sergeant who removed a German woman prisoner's chains, both literal and metaphorical, and told her in effect that she belonged now to a different understanding of human worth, represents thousands of such small transformations. Most of these stories were never recorded. The people involved did not see themselves as making history. They were simply trying to navigate extraordinary circumstances with whatever wisdom and decency they could muster. They were learning to see each other as fully human despite everything their respective societies had taught them about who deserved recognition and respect. These stories matter because they complicate simple narratives about that era. They remind us that even within systems built on hatred and division, individual humans retained the capacity to transcend those systems. They show that teaching and learning about fundamental moral questions could happen anywhere between anyone, if both parties brought sufficient courage and openness to the encounter. They demonstrate that changing deeply held beliefs was possible, though rarely easy, and that such change often occurred through accumulated small interactions rather than sudden dramatic revelations. For Margaretha Hoffman, the transformation began with confused dissonance, her expectations contradicted by reality. It continued through daily exposure to someone whose competence and character could not be reconciled with the categories she had been taught. It deepened through conversations that challenged her assumptions while respecting her capacity to think and grow. It solidified through the ongoing work of integrating new understanding into her sense of self and her approach to living. And it persisted through decades of choices to act according to that new understanding, even when doing so was uncomfortable or cost her relationships with those who had not undergone similar transformation. For Thomas Washington, his work with prisoners represented an extension of the teaching and modeling he had done throughout his adult life. He approached prisoners as he approached students, as human beings capable of growth, worthy of respect, needing both challenge and support to develop their full potential. He did not see his role as punishing or humiliating them, but rather as creating conditions where they might begin to question the ideologies that had led them to support such destructive systems. He did this not because he thought it would necessarily succeed in every case, but because treating people with dignity was simply the right way to live, regardless of circumstances. The facility outside Montgomery represented a liminal space where normal social structures were temporarily suspended or inverted. A black American held authority over white German prisoners. Women who had believed in theories of racial hierarchy found themselves dependent on the mercy of those they had been taught to consider inferior. Normal social scripts did not apply, creating space for new interactions and new understanding to emerge. Not everyone took advantage of this space. Many prisoners maintained their previous beliefs despite contradictory evidence. But some, like Margaret, found in this strange circumstance the opportunity to rebuild their moral framework on sturdier foundations. This story also illuminates the peculiar contradictions of American society during that era. Thomas Washington wore the uniform of a nation fighting against regimes built on racial hierarchy, while that nation maintained its own systems of racial oppression. He could supervise enemy prisoners with full authority while being denied basic rights in his home state. The irony was profound and painful. Yet Thomas navigated this contradiction with remarkable grace, neither ignoring it nor allowing it to embitter him to the point of ineffectiveness. He worked within the systems available to him, using whatever influence he had to treat people decently and to model alternatives to dehumanization. The encounter between Thomas and Margaret thus represented several intersecting ironies. A man denied full dignity by his own society, teaching dignity to an enemy prisoner. A prisoner from a regime built on racial theories, learning to question those theories from someone her ideology defined as inferior. An American soldier fighting for freedom abroad while his people struggled for basic rights at home. A teacher who could not teach in integrated schools, teaching the most important lessons to someone from a nation that had constructed education systems explicitly designed to indoctrinate children with hateful ideologies. These ironies do not negate the genuine transformation that occurred. If anything, they make it more remarkable. Thomas Washington helped Margaret learn to see beyond artificial categories, precisely because he himself lived every day with the consequences of such categories. He understood in his bones what systems of hierarchy cost humanity, because he paid that cost continuously. His wisdom came not from abstract philosophy, but from lived experience of oppression, and his determination to maintain dignity and moral clarity despite that oppression. The relationship between Thomas and Margaret also raises questions about responsibility, guilt, and the possibility of redemption. Margaret had worked for a regime that committed atrocities on an almost incomprehensible scale. She had not personally killed anyone, had not directly participated in the worst horrors, but her efficient work had supported the system that made those horrors possible. How should we judge her culpability? How much does her later transformation matter morally? Thomas Washington offered one answer through his treatment of her and other prisoners. He held them accountable by requiring work and obedience to rules, by not pretending that their previous allegiances were acceptable or unimportant. But he also offered them dignity and the opportunity for growth. He seemed to believe that people could change, that moral development was possible even for those who had supported terrible things, and that such change should be encouraged rather than foreclosed by permanent condemnation. This approach was neither naive nor soft. Thomas did not minimize the regime's crimes or excuse those who had supported it. But he recognized that many ordinary people had been caught up in systems they did not create and did not fully understand, had made choices they later regretted, and might genuinely learn and grow if given the opportunity. He treated Margaret as someone capable of moral development because he believed most humans possessed that capacity, regardless of their past errors. Margaret's transformation thus represents a particular kind of moral possibility, the chance to recognize error, change understanding, and then live according to that new understanding. This was not redemption in any complete sense. She could not undo her past participation in an evil system, but she could refuse to continue defending that system, could acknowledge her complicity honestly, could work to build something different going forward. Thomas Washington helped her see this possibility and encouraged her to pursue it. The decades following their brief intersection showed the fruit of such transformation. Margaret lived according to different principles, influenced others toward questioning rather than blind acceptance, contributed in small ways to building a different kind of Germany. Her impact was modest in the scale of history, but significant in the lives she touched. The ripples of that one encounter between a black American sergeant and a German prisoner extended across decades and touched hundreds of lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. This is how moral progress often works, not through grand dramatic gestures, but through accumulated small acts of courage, patience, and human decency. People like Thomas Washington doing their work with integrity, treating others with dignity, modeling alternatives to hatred and dehumanization. People like Margaret having the courage to question their own certainties, to admit error, to rebuild their understanding on sturdier moral foundations. These small transformations, multiplied across millions of individual encounters and choices, gradually shift what becomes possible for entire societies. The story also reminds us that the capacity for moral blindness exists in every time and place, not just in obviously extreme circumstances. Every society constructs categories of people it encourages its members to dismiss, exploit, or dehumanize. These categories change across time and context, but the basic dynamic remains, teaching people that certain others are less worthy of dignity, rights, or consideration. Resisting such categorization requires the same humility and questioning that Margaret eventually developed, the same refusal to accept comfortable certainties that Thomas Washington modeled. Understanding this history thus becomes relevant to the present. We may not face the specific circumstances of 1945, but we face the same fundamental human tendencies toward tribalism, category thinking, and dehumanization of those defined as other. Learning from stories like Thomas and Margaret's means recognizing these tendencies in ourselves and our societies, questioning them actively, and choosing to extend dignity and recognition across all artificial boundaries. The physical evidence of their encounter has long since vanished. The buildings have been demolished, the records filed away in archives, the people themselves returned to dust. But the lessons persist, available to anyone willing to engage seriously with this history. These lessons about human capacity for growth and change, about the possibility of bridging even vast ideological divides through patient interaction and mutual respect, about the importance of treating all humans with dignity, regardless of what systems encourage us to believe about their worth. Margaret Hoffman died in 2004, her transformation complete. Her life a testament to the possibility of fundamental moral growth. Thomas Washington died 21 years earlier, his quiet dignity and consistent principles having touched countless lives in ways he never fully knew. Their brief intersection in a small facility outside Montgomery represents one small piece of a much larger tapestry of human interaction during those extraordinary years. But examined closely, their story reveals truths that transcend their particular circumstances, truths about teaching and learning, about prejudice and its overcoming, about the hard work of moral development, and the possibility that humans can rise above even the most comprehensive systems of indoctrination and hate. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.